Irene, they're ready to go? All set? Okay. Okay, I'm going to call this meeting to order. This is a special meeting of the Desert Community College District Board of Trustees. It's now called to order at 8:12 a.m. You may join today's meeting in person via Zoom webinar or watch the live stream with the College of the Desert YouTube channel. These links are accessible by visiting the College of the Desert homepage. If we could have roll call, Dr. Garcia, please proceed with the roll call.
Good morning. Trustee Perez.
Here.
Trustee Kinnaman.
Present.
Trustee Gonzalez.
Good morning, present.
Trustee Oden.
Here.
And Trustee Stefan.
Present. At this time, we'll have the Pledge of Allegiance. If I could have Trustee Oden, please lead us in that.
It gives me great pleasure to put my hand over my heart and pledge allegiance to this country. Ready, begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you so much. At this time, we'll have the confirmation of the agenda. Are there any additions, corrections, or deletions to the agenda for June 1st, 2023?
None.
Hearing none, the agenda stands approved as presented. Public comments. 3.01, the public comments. Remote public participation is allowed and will be accepted in person, by email, to otp@collegeofthedesert.edu during the meeting and submitted for record, or by using the raise your hand function by joining the Zoom link. Pursuant to the district administrative procedures 2345, each speaker will be allowed a maximum of 3 minutes per topic. 15 minutes shall be the maximum time allotment for public speakers on any one subject, regardless of the number of speakers at any one board meeting. An exception will be made for members of the public who utilize a translator. Such persons will be allowed a maximum of 6 minutes per topic. At the discretion of the majority of the board, these limits may be extended. All comments must be submitted or brought forward prior to the end of the public comment section. Are there any public comments that have been received?
There are no public comments.
And there's no one in the House that would like to speak. So what I would like to do, though, is take one moment of privilege here to give an update on former trustee Fred Yount. He's had his surgery to correct his medical condition. It was touch and go, but he's doing much better. He still needs us to remember him daily, because he is still got to take it very easy for the next few months to make sure that his surgery remains successful. So if I could have everybody just keep that in their hearts and minds, I'd appreciate that. Thank you very much. And at this time, we are going to have a study session. It is on equal employment opportunity. It is the EEO training. At this time, I'd like to welcome Alicia Stein-Manis with Liebert, Cassidy, and Whitmore to present this training. Oop.
Good morning, trustees. Dr. Garcia, thank you for having me. I know you all know who I am, but I'm Alicia Stein-Manis. I'm a partner with Liebert, Cassidy, Whitmore. And so we're going to spend the next hour training on equal employment opportunity, legal requirements, and best practices. This is our agenda. It is packed. So I'm happy to take questions, but I also know you have a long day ahead of you, so if you can wait until the end, I would appreciate that so I can get through the materials. So why are you here having this study session this morning? It's because it's legal, primarily because it's legally mandated. So Title V requires that all individuals, whether they are trustees, whether they are administrators, whether they are any staff at the district, whether they are consultants that assist in directly assist in training process, screening and selection processes, to undergo a training that addresses the laws and regulations regarding non-discrimination, the educational benefits of workforce diversity, elimination of bias in hiring decisions, and best practices for serving on screening and selection committees. So you're receiving this today because you are in the process of identifying an interim CEO. And even if you were moving from one permanent CEO to another, it is recommended that you receive this training, say every 2 years, but certainly before you participate in screening and selection processes. There's also an additional requirement, and this is a new requirement for this board based on revisions to Title V that went into effect in November of 2022. And it's that boards of trustees also have to receive training on the role of the Equal Employment Opportunity Advisory Committee and how we call it the EEOAC, drafts and implements a district's EEO plan. So I'm going to be talking about all 5 of these requirements in the next hour. There are no time or frequency requirements for this training, but similar to how you receive anti-harassment and discrimination training under Assembly Bill 1661 every 2 years, we do recommend every other year. And at a minimum, it would be an hour training, but I train all throughout the state on these issues, and I could go for 3-4 hours if I needed to. So I'm going to briefly talk about the laws and regulations and then a few district standards. Again, this is not your Assembly Bill 1661 training, so I'm going to breeze through some of this so we can get to the meat of this training. So these are the primary federal and state anti-discrimination laws. There's the first 4 are federal laws, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination, retaliation, and harassment. Title IX of the Educational Amendments Act, which prohibits gender and sex discrimination in the educational setting. Americans with Disabilities Act, it sounds obvious, but it prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability status in both educational settings as well as in employment settings. Age Discrimination and Employment Act, and then really what our bread and butter is in California, the Fair Employment and Housing Act, or what we attorneys refer to as the FEHA. And the FEHA prohibits discrimination and harassment on various protected classes as well as retaliation. So when I say prohibiting discrimination, what I mean is prohibiting certain actions that are referred to as adverse employment actions. So for your purposes, when we're talking about equal employment opportunity hiring, what we're talking about primarily is the refusal to hire based on a protected status. But it could be other things too, rejection from a training program, a decision to terminate an employee, even a decision to suspend an employee, and other decisions that could affect the terms and benefits of someone's employment. These are the protected classifications under the Fair Employment and Housing Act. They are extensive. The reason I say that the FEHA is your bread and butter is because the number of protected classifications under the FEHA are much more expansive than under federal law. And I'm not going to go through all these, but I do want to point out a few things. One, in the last few years, the FEHA has expanded its definition of sex and gender discrimination to include discrimination on the basis of gender identity and gender expression. In, I believe it was 2020 or 2021, the California legislature passed the Crown Act, which prohibits, which includes in the definition of race traits historically associated with race, including but not limited to hair texture, protective hairstyles, and defines protective hairstyles to include, but not necessarily be limited to, hairstyles such as braids, locks, and twists. So I'm pointing those out to you primarily because they are newer additions to the law. And the last thing I want to point out is this last bullet point on the right-hand column, association with or perception with membership in a protected class. Essentially what that's saying, even if an individual is not a member of one of these protected classes, if they are perceived to be a member of a protected class and an adverse action is taken against them because of that perception, or if they are harassed because of that perception, then that is also protected under the FEHA. They could also bring a discrimination harassment complaint. And then the association is really a close association. So the example I give is if you have a family member who is disabled and you take care of that family member and your employer takes an adverse employment action against you, you yourself are not disabled, but there could be an argument that someone was discriminated against because they are closely associated with someone that is part of a protected class. We are seeing a lot of those. I, in my litigation practice, have seen a lot of those cases in the last few years, particularly as it relates to association with close friends or family members who identify as part of the LGBTQ plus community. Okay. So 1996, I'm sure you are all aware of Proposition 209, but in 1996, the California voters passed Proposition 209, which amended the California Constitution, and I'm going to read you what the California Constitution says now. It says, the state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, public education, or public contracting. Essentially, what Proposition 209 did was it invalidated most forms of traditional affirmative action. And at the time that Proposition 209 was passed and the California Constitution was amended, the California community college system had a equal employment opportunity hiring process that and I know many of you are aware of this, you've worked in the system or been in the system for a very long time, so I realize I may be telling you things you already know, but that included what is called targeted recruitment, essentially using a quota system to address underrepresentation in the workforce. And the California court system, in a case called Connerly versus State Personnel Board, basically said, under Proposition 209, this system is no longer permissible. You cannot just hire from certain protected classes because they've been identified as underrepresented in your workforce. So there was a legislative response to Proposition 209. And the California community college system and with support from the state legislature made a few changes. One change, although this was in place for in some way for pre-1996, says that part of your budget, the funding that you receive from the state, is contingent upon sustaining a recruiting, training, EO program and system that will result in equal opportunities. So while districts cannot engage in targeted recruitment, what the legislature has opined and what the California community college system has done through promulgation of revisions to Title V say that focused outreach and recruitment is okay as long as it is a component of general recruitment. So an example of this is if you identify in your workforce that the members of who identify as Black or African American are underrepresented in your workforce. You cannot just recruit from that protected class. But what you can do is have your general recruitment and then go to job fairs at historically Black colleges and universities and have that additional focus recruitment as long as it is a part of your generalized recruitment. And that's how the California Community College system has addressed balancing the need to address equal employment opportunity, the legal requirement that you address underrepresentation in a district's workforce. Underrepresentation will look different at College of the Desert than it may at a different community college in a different part of the state. But that is the balance that the state has struck in order to allow for continued outreach to address equal employment opportunity. So this may make me a nerd, but I do have a favorite education code section, and it is section 87-360. And what it says is that academic and administrative applicants must demonstrate sensitivity to and understanding of the diverse academic, socioeconomic, cultural, and ethnic backgrounds of community college students. When I counsel districts on what this means, what we say is that what we generally suggest is that districts treat this requirement as either an essential or required qualification for administrative and academic positions. So you will see on job descriptions, it will say must demonstrate sensitivity to an understanding of the diverse academic, socioeconomic, etc. What's missing from this? Who's missing from this? Classified service is missing. The way I describe this is an education code bias that should not exist. The education code has left out, the legislature at the time that this statute was passed did not, in my opinion, focus sufficiently on how important it is for a district's classified service to also have this attribute. Now, I think very recently, as of fall 2022, the state chancellor's office has addressed this through revisions to Title V, which are going to require that administrators, the academic service, and the classified service now in the evaluation process demonstrate sensitivity to the diversity of the community college. So while most districts I work with have this as a required qualification for their classified service too, legally it's not required, but it's going to be really important to require this in job descriptions because ultimately classified staff are going to be evaluated on various diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility principles. Okay. So Title V also requires that districts adopt EEO plans, and they have to cover a 3-year period. I have linked a copy of the district's EEO plan to these slides. It is online. The district currently has a deadline to update its EEO plan of October of this year, and I know that your district's Equal Employment Opportunity Advisory Committee is currently in the process of making those updates. This is not the training for this, but there were recent revisions to Title V that were pretty extensive, and EEOAC committees throughout the state, districts throughout the state are being trained on those revisions. And the one thing I do want to point out is that what the Title V regulations say is it requires districts to take steps to eliminate underrepresentation based on protected status. Underrepresentation is defined by Title V, and it's essentially, it uses the term monitored group, but essentially there are certain protected classes that a district may monitor because they've been identified as being underrepresented in your workforce in the past. And if a percentage of persons in that protected class, in that monitored group, is employed by the district at a rate of less than 80% of what you would expect that protected that protected status group to be employed, then there is an underrepresentation of that protected group in your district. And there's guidance from the state chancellor's office about how to collect data related to that. That is an entirely different training. Okay. Title V also requires districts to establish an EEO advisory committee to develop, revise, and implement a district's EEO programs and plans. And those EEO programs and plans are really the strategies that a district adopts to address underrepresentation in their workforce. And one of the newest revisions to Title V is that an EEOAC must be composed of diverse membership, and the language of Title V says it must include members from district stakeholders, including but not limited to students, faculty, and classified staff. I think it's important to remember that when Title V says must be composed of diverse membership, we're not talking about protected class, because remember, you cannot make decisions based on an individual's protected class. But if you think about who may be part of your academic service, who may be a part of your student population, who may be a part of your classified service, sometimes expanding the number of employees or students who serve on the EEOC committee, who come from various stakeholder groups, classified, unions, senates, that can also result in diversity. But remember, diversity, not just about protected status, but about diverse academic, socioeconomic, cultural, and ethnic backgrounds. So there are different ways for an EEOC to be diverse. I just want to point out that what's listed on this slide, the role of the EEOAC committee, is from College of the Desert's Equal Employment Opportunity Plan. And what the plan says is that the EEOAC serves as the advisory body to the EEO officer, who the district has identified as the Vice President of Human Resources. Their responsibilities are to monitor equal employment opportunity progress, make suggestions to revise EEO plans, and recommend other measures to promote equal employment opportunities, policies, and procedures. And then they may also sponsor events and trainings related to equal employment opportunity. So the educational benefits of workforce diversity. So the California community college system is known for its strong commitment to diversity. When I love working with my community college clients, I can't tell you how many times I've heard from a superintendent president, a chancellor, other administrators, CCDs are unique. We accept everyone. We are California. We represent the diversity of the state. But it's also at the core mission of the California Community College system. It's a system that provides excellent academic instruction to very diverse range of Californians, some who are seeking to transfer, some who are not, some who are just taking a class to engage in the learning process, and every community is different. But there's also data and research that shows that there are educational benefits to workforce diversity. Some benefits are that supporting equal employment opportunities, supporting diversity, facilitates recruitment and retention of staff, makes a district more attractive to students, engenders creative thinking and problem solving, and vitalizes the educational environment. And it's also really important to understand, and I hear this a lot, well, I hear a lot of districts talk about workforce diversity in terms of student demographics. And I always remind districts, it legally cannot be a one-to-one comparison. You cannot base your workforce on what the student population looks like, even though there is data which shows that students from diverse backgrounds may learn better from people of similar backgrounds or people that look like them. But that's just one component of diversity, because you also want to look at majority populations. You want more women instructors in STEM because you want to expose male students to that. You want more individuals who identify as Black or African American part of your academic service, because you want to expose majority populations, not always majority populations, but populations that may not be considered diverse in the traditional sense, to leaders, to educators from different backgrounds. So there's a balance of those two facets that are really important when talking about diversity. And so looking at it from a narrow view of we just have to look at what our students look like is not telling the whole story, and really does not benefit the entire population. I just want to point out, I'm not going to spend time on this slide, that the State Chancellor's Office put together a task force, I think it was in 2018, regarding, it's called the Vision for Success, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force. And they came out with a report in 2020 that I recommend that you look at if you have not done so before. But these are some of the key findings. I do want to focus on number 3, which is faculty and staff diversity reduces the likelihood of implicit bias. So as we transition into the next slides, I think an important takeaway is that the more diverse a workforce, the hope is that there is more dialogue between people from, whether it's a diverse protected class or diverse socioeconomic or educational backgrounds, that allows people to think about their own inherent biases, to be respectful of other people's opinions, and that leads to creating a more diverse workforce, because then you are interrupting your own biases. So how we've been brought up, what we've learned from the family that has raised us, how we've been socialized, our exposure to various identities and social groups, who our friends are, what media we watch, all affect how we think and we feel about people. And this is a bias that I think a lot of people have. Good people have biases too. I have biases. I grew up in a middle-class family. My parents sent me to private school. It was not a very diverse community. My private school emphasized the importance of immediately enrolling in a 4-year university. Community college was not an option for me, not because my parents wouldn't have supported me, but my school wouldn't have. And it wasn't until I started doing this work about a decade ago that I was able to interrupt a bias that I had regarding community colleges. Community colleges are incredible. I am so impressed by this system, but I wasn't exposed to the system in the community that I grew up in. And so I always thought, my parents spent all this money on my education, I should go to a 4-year university. And had I known what benefits this system provides, I may have made a different decision. I think I'm a good person. I have my own biases. So I think it's important to reflect and recognize that we all have our own biases, whether they are about protected class or some other issue in our lives. And I will tell you that doing these trainings all throughout the state have also allowed me to interrupt biases when I participate in hiring decisions at my firm. I run our I run our summer program, and I've had to say, oh well, she has a resume a lot like me. I like her. I want to hire her. But why do I want to hire someone exactly like me? And I have to think about what benefits there would be to hire someone that brings a different perspective, that has, different experiences. And this training has helped me in my own life, but it takes work to interrupt our biases. So a bias is defined as a particular tendency, trend, inclination, feeling, or opinion, especially one is that preconceived or unreasoned. There are two types of biases. There is unconscious and conscious bias. Unconscious bias is a bias that operates automatically, quickly, with little or no effort. You don't even necessarily think about it. An example is if you're walking, I'm short, I'm 5'1", I walk under a tree, I still duck. Walk under a branch, doesn't matter, I'm not gonna hit it, but I'm taught to just be careful, right? That's an unconscious bias. A conscious bias is where you're actively allocating attention, where you are making decisions based on biases that you have. This training is not about conscious bias. It's about interrupting unconscious biases. And so that's what we are going to talk about for the next few slides. So I said this already, but our biases come from our identities, our experiences, our history. It's important to recognize and remember that we're products of distinct backgrounds, experiences, education, family relations, various values, and that can all impact our biases in good ways and in bad ways. But if we don't recognize the biases that we have, and think about where we have unconscious biases that lead to certain decisions that we make, then sometimes you operate in more of a bubble and you're too focused on certain issues. There are various issues. Our biases impact perception, attitude, behaviors, attention, listening skills, microaffirmations, which is how we may comfort people in certain situations. People underestimate the influence that self-interest has on their own judgments, and people overestimate the influence that self-interest has on other people's judgments. So there are two studies. They're now, I would say, about 10 to 20 years old, but I think they're still important to discuss. There was one study out of Princeton University that asked people how susceptible the average person was to a long list of judgmental biases. The majority of people claimed to be less biased than they judged the average person to be. And then there was a study of medical residents, and the residents said that 84% of the study participants said that their colleagues were influenced by gifts from pharmaceutical companies, but only 16% said that they were similarly influenced. We want to think that we're not biased. Not true. Good people can be biased, and it's important to address different types of biases. So these are some examples of biases that come up a lot in hiring and decision-making processes. The first is the bandwagon effect. So the tendency to do or believe things because other people are doing them or believing them. And this may come from a desire to be right. Sometimes the majority thinks that they are right, so you want to insert yourself in the majority. It may come from a need to be included. and it may come from what is called groupthink, which is when you see everyone doing something, there's a tremendous pressure to conform with what other individuals are doing. Then there's confirmation bias, a tendency to confirm what we already believe is true. What we believe is true may not be biased, but you may learn something during a hiring process or a decision-making process that confirms what you thought was true already, and that's called confirmation bias. There's the negativity effect, which is the tendency to allow negative things that you learn, let's say in a hiring process, to be more significant than something that would be positive or neutral. So the way I describe this when I'm talking to screening and selection committees is this bias, this negativity effect, is why you have to take notes when you're conducting interviews, because you are going to remember the negative attributes of a candidate much more, more easily than the positive attributes. It's important to write down everything, the good and the bad. It's the same advice that I provide to clients in regards to performance evaluations. You don't just talk about the negative performance issues in a performance evaluation. You also talk about the positive. You also talk about the satisfactory. Because you're just going to always remember the negative better than the positive. And then there's affinity bias, which I mentioned in my own biases, the tendency to have affinity for certain people or behaviors. So if I'm looking at a resume and I see a candidate who went to my alma mater, and I'm like, oh, that's great. They probably sat in the same place I did, and people watched like I did. I want to hire them because I want to talk to them about their experiences at my alma mater. That's an affinity bias. Just because we got a degree from the same place doesn't mean that that candidate is the best person for the job or has the knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the job for which we're recruiting. And so when you're thinking about these biases, you have to think, why am I looking at this particular issue in this way? Is this a reason to like in the hiring context, to like a candidate, to not like a candidate? What are their skills? What's their knowledge base? Do they have the ability to do this job based on the job description for which they're being hired? Okay. There are two myths. Whether a candidate resonates with me on a personal level provides a reliable predictor of whether the candidate will do a good job. That is a myth. That is not true. How someone performs in an interview setting provides a reliable predictor of how that person will interact with me in the work setting. That is mostly not true. I say mostly because, for example, if a faculty member as part of a recruitment process is asked to do a demonstrative component, then that's really important to see, can they teach the subject they're going to be asked to teach. But people can be shy, people can be nervous in interviews, and that doesn't mean that they won't, their personalities will not come out when they're actually doing their job. So it's really important to be careful about looking at personality traits when you're conducting interviews and really focusing, again, on what we call the KSAs, the knowledge, skills, and abilities to do someone's job. Okay. So interrupting your unconscious bias, there's really three components. There's awareness of self, there's awareness of others, and there are institutional commitments, which you, as the board, as the policy-making body of College of the Desert, are critical to supporting, even if you are delegating the day-to-day responsibilities to your superintendent president and then to her staff. So awareness of self is thinking about your own biases, questioning your own biases, checking your own assumptions, and being curious. And when I say curious, yes, ask questions, but do so in a respectful way. Don't go to your one, if if you don't identify as Black or African American, don't go to your one Black or African American friend and ask them all the questions you have on race relations. Do the work yourself, but that doesn't mean you can't have a respectful, curious dialogue with people you consider to be colleagues and friends, but you can't rely on one person to do the work for you. But so curiosity does require a level of respect as well. And it also requires listening skills. I think some people do more talking than listening. They're asking questions, not listening to the answer so that they can then respond. Curiosity requires that you practice your listening skills, because you're not going to grow and learn unless you really listen and try to understand someone else's perspective. Awareness of others. So I'm going to focus on the second point, what you say and how they hear it. So I was conducting for another community college district a DEIA training, and we were talking about microaggressions. And I asked the individuals who are participating in this training, have you experienced any microaggressions in your work? And one individual raised his hand. He said he was an adjunct. He was a Black man, and he said he was an adjunct professor and worked in STEM. And he said, I was giving a presentation to a group of people on one of the topics I considered myself an expert in. And presentation went great. And either right after the presentation or even during the presentation, an older white man raised his hand and said, I'm really impressed with how much you know about this subject. And we had a discussion about how that statement made him feel. And for him, his immediate reaction was, you only said that to me because you're surprised that a Black man in STEM was so eloquent. That may not have been what the person who made the comment intended, but that's the difference between understanding that what you say may be perceived differently by people from diverse backgrounds with diverse experiences. It's an example of a microaggression, so it's really important to be careful with your words, to be attentive to reactions. That can be body language, that can be someone, leaving a conversation early because they don't want to further engage. So understanding that a statement you make may sound innocuous, you may think it's innocuous, but it isn't necessarily going to be innocuous to the person who is receiving the comment. Institutional commitments. So in context of hiring, a lot of districts, or a handful of districts throughout the state, are conducting some interesting pilot programs to address really unconscious bias. They're removing, for example, names, addresses, years individuals graduated from an institution of higher education from their applications, so that it is really considered a blind hiring process. There is another bias called name bias, where there have been studies that have shown that someone with a name like Jim or Jennifer is more likely to get an interview than someone with a name that may sound, and I want to be careful with using this word, but really what the study says is more ethnic. And so removing names is important. Addresses, also zip codes can matter. So where you come from may make a difference in whether you get an interview. And so districts are exploring ways to conduct blind hiring. There was a study done decades and decades ago with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, where men and women would come and perform in front of the hiring committee, and more men, and this was I think 1920s, 30s, 40s, would get hired. So they were like, why don't we have more women that are part of this orchestra? So they put up a screen. So people would play their music, and it still wasn't really helping. And then they realized that it wasn't helping because people would walk across the stage and women were wearing heels. And so even though you couldn't see if someone was a man or a woman, you could hear if they were very likely male or female. And so then applicants had to take off their shoes, and that helped with at least the gender diversity of the orchestra. And so those are just examples of how institutions are addressing unconscious biases. Okay. Last section, hiring committee best practices for promoting equity and diversity. So I usually spend a lot of time on this slide, but I know I'm running out of some time. So I'm going to go through this relatively quickly, but I really talk about 3 overarching 30,000-foot principles of lawful EEO hiring. The first principle is that protected status of candidates is never a factor. That's Proposition 209. That's the FEHA. That's an easy principle. The second principle, infusing commitment to diversity and equity in the hiring process, does not involve lowering standards. So when we talk about equal employment opportunity, when we talk about DEIA, I have had conversations with people that say, well, basically what you're saying, what affirmative action is you're saying that we're lowering our standards and we're not hiring the best people for the job. That's not an accurate understanding of what equal employment opportunity is, what diversity, equity, and inclusion are. What purposeful hiring strategies do is they rethink who it can be predicted to be qualified and best qualified for a job. The harder message is that it's based on a false premise, this idea that lowering standards is what DEIA, EO, affirmative action is all about. It's based on a false premise that without affirmative action, hiring practices would reflect a pure meritocracy. We've had affirmative action in this country for over 200 years. It's just mostly been affirmative action towards white men, and then I would say more recently towards white women. So it's based on a false premise that hiring is a purely meritorious system, and it's not. And I think that if you have those conversations with stakeholder groups or constituents or your friends or your family, I think those are 2 important things to think about. It has nothing to do with lowering standards. It has to do with rethinking, are these actually the standards that are needed to perform this job? Rethinking what the knowledge, skills, and abilities are for a particular position. And then the last principle is infusing commitment to diversity and equity into the hiring process does involve assessing candidates against job-related criteria. So I usually talk about this in 2 buckets. 1, eliminating irrational barriers, and updating job-related criteria. So in the context of the community college system, what I consider to be often the 2 most significant, maybe 3 most significant irrational barriers to receiving an interview. 1 is even on a job description saying doctorate preferred. I understand that there may be some stakeholder groups that disagree with me, but from a legal perspective, preferring a doctorate when a master's is enough is going to result in certain people who have the qualifications for a job not applying because they think that they will never get hired without a doctorate. And so, again, I'm not an academic employee. I'm not a counselor. I'm not telling you what should be reasonable predictors of success in a particular position, but I am here to tell you that if you even have that preferred qualification on a job description, unless it is a minimum qualification, it's going to lead to less diversity in your applicant pools, and then you are not going to be able to address underrepresentation. The other big one I see in the system is community college experience preferred. I describe that as a secret handshake. Why do your faculty, your classified staff need to know the secret community college handshake? What if you have a counselor, an applicant for a counselor position who ran a nonprofit for high school students, supporting them with college applications? Why are they not just as qualified for a job as someone who has previous community college experience? So those, and that then makes pools less diverse. So those are really, I would say, the two prominent examples that I see in my work that are considered irrational barriers and could lead to less diversity in pools. Then expanding and updating what is job related. So taking faculty as an example, looking at what our educators do and making sure it's how you recruit. So what I mean by this is that educators provide more than just content knowledge. They can also provide pedagogic knowledge. They may have an understanding of certain teaching methodologies that may be newer to the teaching profession. That doesn't mean younger candidates. That means people who have done the work to learn new teaching methodologies and pedagogies. And ensuring that job descriptions are regularly reviewed and updated to reflect what the individual is actually doing in their job. And so that is a very important part of supporting equal employment opportunity, so that you can create pools of diverse candidates. So the role of a selection committee is to identify the most qualified candidates to either recommend forward to the next level, or since you are the board of trustees, to make a hiring decision regarding an interim or a permanent CEO. Process needs to be objective, job-related, going back to the KSAs, and curious. And specifically for CEO hiring, since it is a process that is addressed in your board policy 24, I believe it's 2431. I want to point out that often the process for an interim appointment is very different than the process for a permanent appointment. Both processes, you're going to have standardized questions asked of candidates. Often you're going to use a consultant, but the process for identifying a permanent CEO is a process that takes longer. It may even include, as this board has done in the past, interviewing consultants to determine which consultant is going to assist with the process. It's not just going to be interviews, it's likely going to be community forums. That it's a much more expansive process to fill the permanent vacancy than to address a vacancy on an interim basis. Some districts use ad hoc committees to help with initial processes, reviewing applications, developing questions. Sometimes a full board deals with that process. It really just depends on what a board wants to do. But per board policy 2431, has to be a fair and open process, it has to be objective, it has to be job related. I less often get to train boards on these issues. So what I say when I'm training HR staff, when I'm training faculty and classified staff, is you will almost certainly go through this standardized screening and selection process. Your HR has a process in place for reviewing applications, for identifying who's going to be interviewed, for asking interview questions. Often where I see breakdowns in process are second round interviews or higher level interviews where standardized processes don't always exist. Haven't seen it here. But I have seen examples where a final round interview is taking place and a member of a leadership team is not asking the same questions to each candidate. That is a terrible practice because you can't compare one candidate to another if you're not seeking the same information from them. And so that it's really important to understand that no matter what level of the hiring process, it has to be consistent for all candidates. You have to be fair and objective to evaluate candidates. Often when you get to hiring at administrative levels, the board of trustee level, there is a chance that a member of a screening or selection committee may know a candidate. The full board needs to participate in the hiring of a CEO, but it's important that every trustee really is only assessing the candidate against the knowledge, skills, and abilities to do their job, not because you like the person. So really, this goes back to the unconscious bias piece, interrupting your own unconscious bias. Did I like that person's answer because I like them or because it was a good answer? What was this question intended to measure? And did the answer accurately address what the question asked? And then really important, if you're on a committee, if you're committing to engaging in the process, giving it your full attention. You all know this, but much of your staff have property rights in their employment. If you cannot give your full attention to the hiring process, I know this doesn't apply to CEOs, but if people cannot give their full attention to hiring process, to attending meetings, and you hire the wrong person because you weren't paying attention, that is potentially could have negative implications for the institution. So putting whatever else you have aside and focusing, whether it's for a day, whether it's for a day and a half, 2 days, whatever it is critically important to hiring the right individuals for particular jobs. We've talked this already, but really in creating a standardized process. So reviewing job announcements, job descriptions before they're posted, even if they were reviewed a year or 2 years ago, making sure that they are accurate, developing standardized criteria for paper screening, for interview questions, if there is a demonstrative component for that, creating a ratings form, and if time, where possible, I think it's also important to, we believe it's important to create model answers. What do we want to hear from a candidate in regards to this, their answer to this question, so that everyone who is participating in the screening and hiring process is measuring the same thing. I said this multiple times, assess candidates against the knowledge, skills, and abilities to do their job. Don't bring in outside knowledge until the reference check stage, which is HR's job or the consultant's job who is assisting with the hiring process. That means no Googling. That means not looking in the newspaper. That is not your job. You are looking at the four corners of the job description. You are listening to their answers. You are looking at what they shared with you in an interview. And that is how you are assessing the candidates to determine who's a finalist or who is going to be made an offer of employment. HR or your consultants or legal are the experts in conducting the reference check, but sometimes those experts will look to the committee to address content issues in fashioning how a reference check may take place. And then these processes are confidential. Applicants have privacy rights in the process. So the district has anyone who participates in a screening and hiring process sign a confidentiality agreement, because just like employees, applicants have certain privacy rights as well. Again, the process has to be neutral, objective. There has to be meaning in the community college context, meaningful consideration to the sensitivity to diversity requirement. You're assessing just job related criteria. When I say do it right the first time, I have worked with other districts where they have had to restart a process because the screening committee was not properly trained and did not engage in these best practices and considered attributes that they should not have in the hiring process. So if you do it right the first time, you're not going to have to redo it. HR is your resource, legal is a resource. So interviews should be robust, but they're not going to be all inclusive. You have to pick the questions that are most important, because otherwise you're going to be here for 10 hours per candidate. Generally avoid questions with subparts. Some questions require subparts. Follow-up questions are okay if they're really related to the candidate's answer, but you shouldn't be asking questions of a candidate that are not related to that answer and are not on the list of questions, because then you're extending the length of the interview, you're not comparing candidates against each other because you're asking different questions. It's also really important to remember that you're being interviewed. It's not just you're interviewing a candidate, but is this candidate thinking, this committee seems not to agree on certain issues. They're not respecting each other when each member is asking questions. They're not warm. They're not curious. Why would I want to work here? So it's a two-way street. And that's all it. So I'm happy to answer questions. I appreciate your time, and that's it. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Alicia. Are there any additional questions from any members of the board? Joel, do you have any questions you'd like to ask? Trustee Perez? Trustee Gonzalez? We'll give Ron a moment to return. Or Trustee Oden a moment to return. I would like to mention to the board that there are multiple opportunities through the California Community College League for additional training, both webinars and at the conferences. There are always many training sessions on this subject. And their ACCT now has online webinars and trainings that you can adhere to. I am recording all the trainings that we are doing this year, and I'm going to ask our administrative assistant to put these together so that all trustees have this information so that we can apply for that certification as trustees. And make sure that we all become certified in that to regain the confidence of the public in our training and our abilities. Okay. And Trustee Oden, did you have any questions you wanted to ask our trainer today, Alicia? Okay, thank you. At this time, we'll go into public comments. Requests to address the Board of Trustees regarding matters not on the agenda. Remote public participation is allowed and will be accepted in person by email to otp@collegeofthedesert.edu during the meeting and submitted for the record, or by using the raise your hand function by joining the Zoom link. Pursuant to District Administrative Procedures 2345, each speaker will be allowed a maximum of 3 minutes per topic. 15 minutes shall be the maximum time allotment for public speakers on any one subject, regardless of the number of speakers at any one board meeting. At the discretion of the majority of the board, these limits may be extended. All comments must be submitted or brought forward prior to the end of the public comment section. As an additional note, this item is intended for members of the public who wish to speak regarding matters not related to the agenda. Are there any requests to speak?
I believe there's someone with their hand raised on Zoom. I'm trying to ask them if they would like to make a comment.
Okay. Let's give them a moment and see if they respond.
Irene, can you state the name if it's showing and inform them that if they would like to make a public comment, that they'll be transitioned to be able to do that versus
Yeah.
only communicating via the chat
Yes, it
box?
looks like it's Jen and Dunning.
Okay.
So pose the question to Jen if she would like to make a comment.
Yes, hi Jen, would you like to make a public comment? We see that your hand is raised. It looks like she's not responding. Hmm.
Okay, and because there's no one here that would like to make a comment, we'll close the public comment session at this time. And again, I'd like to thank Alicia Steinmenes, the partner of Liebert, Cassidy, and Whitmore, for this wonderful presentation that we had today in training. At this time, we will be recessing to closed session for the next part of our meeting. The live feed of this meeting will continue. Board members, I ask that you please join the closed session at 9:30 if at all possible. And after that, we will reconvene to open session when we conclude our business. Thank you. Trustee Gonzalez. Oh, we have three. Okay. Okay. I'm just waiting for Trustee Gonzalez. We're reconvened to open session at this time. In closed session, the Board of Trustees conducted and concluded interviews of applicants for the interim superintendent president position and directed the district's legal counsel to engage in negotiations with a final interim superintendent president candidate. At this time, I will now adjourn this special board meeting of the Desert Community College District Board of Trustees at 5:14 p.m. Thank you, everybody.